Okay, so we're going to start Unit 2 today. Okay, Unit 2 is biology, okay, life science. So we're going to start out by looking at the basic unit of life, okay, and that is the cell. In the same way we looked at the basic unit of matter for chemistry, which was the atom, okay, we're always going to look at kind of the smallest part, the fundamentals, and then build from there, okay. So we're going to look at cells, a little bit about their structure, but not too much today. We'll get into that later. Right? We're also going to look at some microscopy stuff today because we'll be doing our first lab on Thursday. And we'll be in the lab using the microscopes by Thursday. How many people have used a light microscope before? Okay, good. So most of you have kind of looked through one of those before. We do have to be a bit careful with the microscopes in COVID times. So you will have to make sure you wipe them down as you take turns looking through them. Okay, the microscope knobs and all of that kind of stuff. And we have to keep our masks on, which can be pain in the neck, but we just got to make sure we do all of that kind of stuff when we're in the lab with the microscopes. Okay, so key points for today: the points of the cell theory and how they relate to living organisms. Okay, know who contributed to the development of the cell theory. Okay, recognize the implication of the similarities between plant and animal cells in terms of evolutionary relationships. Okay, so how are plants and animals related? Okay, and at some point during this unit we will talk a little bit about how the idea of evolution and what you learned in religion class are not the mortal enemies you probably thought they were, because people seem to think those two things cannot get along, but they totally can. Okay, so we'll talk about that as well a little bit. All right, for something to be considered alive, what are some things what are some characteristics it should exhibit? Things it should be able to do or things it should have? So, grow, okay, absolutely. Okay, so growth would be one. Okay, what else? Something to be considered alive. What else would it have to do? I still can't. Okay, so, all right, could have some ability to brain. Yeah, the nucleus isn't the brain, and plants don't have brains; they're alive. So, I think I know where you're going with that, but I'm going to say structure, maybe. Right? What else? You're doing it right now. Yeah, it's not so much breathing, but exchange of gases, because even plants exchange carbon dioxide and oxygen, and vice versa. Okay, so there would be some metabolism. Okay, we breathe because we need to burn sugars for energy. That's metabolism. Okay, what else do all living things have the ability to do? What?
Just gotta be alive.
Be alive. Yes, absolutely.
I mean, to exist, we see it almost.
Okay, so be observable?
Yeah.
Okay. This is odd. Usually this is the first thing people come up with. What's something else all living things can do by nature?
Reproduce.
Reproduce. Yeah, absolutely. Okay. Grow. Have metabolism, that is consume energy. Okay. Be observable. Reproduce. Okay. Have structure. Is fire alive?
Yeah.
Is fire a living thing? What does fire not have that all living things do? Have cells. Okay? All living things have cells. But if you don't put that in there, okay, fire can be classified as a living thing. It grows, it consumes fuel, exchanges gases, it's observable, it reproduces. Okay? A spark flies somewhere else, now you got two fires. Okay? It can fit all of those things, right? But it's not a living thing. Now, here's the other thing. What about a virus? virus a living thing? There is significant debate over whether a virus should be considered a living thing or not. Okay? And one of the reasons it's not, or one of the arguments for it not being considered a living thing, is this most important piece of being a living thing. Viruses are not cells. They do not have cells. Okay? Another thing, a virus cannot reproduce on its own. Now, I know you're probably thinking, well, neither can I. I need somebody else if that's going to work. Okay? Yes, that's true. But what I mean is a virus cannot reproduce without a host cell. Right? Lots of single-celled organisms can reproduce without anybody else. They just split in half. A virus can't do that. Okay? A virus reproduces by hijacking your cell. Okay? And I mean that. Literally, it takes it over and makes it do what it wants. Okay? And what it wants is to make more viruses. Okay? So what happens with a virus, like COVID-19 for example, okay, is it will attach to the cell membrane and it will inject into the cell its DNA or RNA, as the case may be. Okay? It's genetic material. It will get injected into the cell. A cell can recognize genetic material. It knows what it is. And if it sees it floating around inside the cell, it right away realizes that's not good. That stuff's not supposed to be in the cell. It's supposed to be in the nucleus with all the other DNA, because that's where DNA gets stored and protected. It's where it's safe. So it'll eventually get back to the nucleus. And once it's there, it'll write itself in to your DNA. It'll splice itself in somewhere. Okay? So what your DNA does is it's a set of instructions that builds you and allows your body to make anything it needs in order to survive. Okay? A prime example could be insulin. Okay? A section of your DNA is a code or a set of instructions for making insulin. If you're diabetic, there's a problem with that. Okay? Your body makes something that's close to insulin, but it doesn't work. Okay? Depending on the level of diabetes that you may have. Okay? But if you have diabetes, that section of the DNA doesn't code for true insulin, and so you can have trouble maintaining your blood sugar. Okay? What a virus's DNA will do is it will cut that section of your DNA out and splice itself in that cell. So now, the next time your cell wants to make insulin, it goes to the section of DNA where insulin is supposed to be, and what does it do? Instead of making insulin, it makes a virus. Because now the DNA that's there is not a code for making insulin, it's a code for making COVID-19. Okay? So your cell makes a COVID-19 virus. And then your cell goes, hey, I wanted insulin. Where did that go? Somebody must have lost the order. Okay, well, I'll just order it again. So order goes back to your nucleus. We want insulin. Goes to the section where your insulin's supposed to be. What does it make? Another COVID-19 virus. And that just keeps happening. Because your cell is not getting what it ordered. It keeps ordering more, and instead of making what it's supposed to make, it keeps making more and more viruses. Okay? Until eventually, the cell fills up with viruses and pops. Now, one virus has replicated itself hundreds or thousands of times. And that cell pops, and hundreds or thousands of viruses are released, each one capable of infecting another cell. Now, do they all succeed? No. But a pretty significant number of them will. And each one of them will multiply hundreds or thousands of times by hijacking another cell. Okay? This is why viral infections can kind of take over quickly, right? I mean, you've all had like the common cold, right? Flu kind of thing. You know, you go to bed and you're like, oh, I've got like a little scratch or a tickle in my throat. You wake up in the morning and you feel like death, okay? Because overnight, that virus has multiplied thousands of times, and now your body is trying to fight it off. Okay? And it's hard for your body to fight a virus, because the only way to kill a virus is to kill the cells that are infected. Okay? Going out and looking for individual viruses in the bloodstream, they're tiny, is nearly impossible for your immune system to do. Okay? Instead, it looks for cells that are infected, because your immune system can do that. It can see when a cell is infected. And so what your body does is it kills the cells that are infected. Okay? It would be the equivalent of if we went around and, oh, you tested positive, gotta kill you. Okay? Like that's what your body does to its own cells when you have a viral infection. Okay? Is it kills any cells that are infected to prevent them from producing more viruses. That's why when you get a viral infection, you just feel wasted. Okay? Like you feel so tired and beat. Because your body's literally destroying itself in order to get better. Okay? If you get a bacterial infection, like food poisoning or something like that, you just feel gross and you puke, and it's the bacteria are producing toxins. Well, your body can find bacteria, it can kill them on its own. You feel a lot different when you have a bacterial infection than when you have a viral infection, because your body fights them differently. Okay? But to kill a viral infection, your body has to destroy its own cells. Okay? And that's tough on your body. Okay? So a virus, there's a lot of argument. Is a virus alive? It doesn't have cells, and that's supposed to be a precursor for a living thing, and it can't reproduce without hijacking another cell. It doesn't do it on its own. Okay? Now, that said, because a virus is not a cell, it also doesn't survive very long on its own, because it can't carry out metabolism, another characteristic of living things. Okay? It can't do any of that stuff that a living thing does. All it can do is infect a host cell.
But would like a contaminated cell, with the virus, would that be a living thing because the cell is not?
Yes, the cell is alive, but the virus is not.
Okay, well, if this virus was in the cell.
Well, the virus is still not doing any of these things, right? It's infected the cell, and all it's done in infecting the cell is inject its genetic material. That's it. Okay? And of course, this is why we wear masks now, and why we're sanitizing everything. Okay? COVID-19 is spread by droplets, right? Like we all know that. That's why we have to cover our faces and stuff like that. Okay, we wear a mask to protect other people, okay, from our droplets. Okay, not so much to protect ourselves from other droplets. Okay, but in those droplets, there are going to be infected cells. Okay, it's not that we're so worried about actual individual viruses being in the droplets. That too. Okay, but more that when I sneeze, some of the cells from my sinuses, some of the cells from the lining of my throat, some of the cells from my lungs where the infection really goes, okay, are going to be ejected when I sneeze or when I cough. Okay? And if someone inhales those viruses, that infected cell, boom, in it goes. Okay? And now I have the infection as well. Great.
How are viruses like created without taking over a cell? Because
Like, how did they come to be in the first place?
Yeah.
No one's really sure on that because there's not much to them. They're basically just a protein shell with genetic material inside, and that's it. There's no cellular machinery or anything. So no one's really sure kind of how they evolved to be, okay? Because there's not really a line of like evolution to trace to them, okay? Whereas there is with all cellular organisms. So no one's really sure on that one. I don't really have a good answer for that question. So that's a really good question because I don't have an answer for it. Okay. Right? Okay, does that sort of make sense? The idea of what classifies something as being truly alive and what doesn't? Okay, and give a little lesson on how viruses work. Okay, so the cell theory. Cell theory has 3 points, so it's a little easier to remember than the atomic theory, which had 4. Okay, and these ones are pretty easy. All right, first point is just like the atomic theory. All living organisms are made of cells. Okay, so that's the first point of the cell theory. All organisms are made of cells. Some organisms are unicellular, so one-celled, like a paramecium or an amoeba, okay, or these. I'm drawing a blank on the name right now. Actinopods, okay, or they could be multicellular, like plants, like this cactus, your cat, your dog, yourself. Okay, we're all multicellular. We have many cells. Okay, many specialized cells, in fact. All right, so all organisms, all living things, okay, are made of cells. Okay, second point of the cell theory is probably the most important one. What is the role of the cell? Okay, the role of the cell is to carry out the basic functions of an organism. Okay, all the things that you do on a large scale, the cell does on a small scale. Okay, and what I mean by things are exchange of gases. Okay, the burning of fuel, the excretion of wastes, okay, the maintaining of like proper temperature, okay, all of that kind of stuff. All of those things are done on a large scale by groups of cells and tissues and organs, okay, but they're also done on a microscopic level or the cellular level by individual cells, okay. Those processes might look different because they're on a smaller scale, but they're still effectively the same thing, okay. Your cell will ingest food particles, okay, sugars, fats, proteins, things like that, and you will ingest whole pieces of food that contain all of those little particles. Okay? Your digestive system just breaks them down and then delivers them to individual cells. Okay? So your cell carries out all those basic functions necessary. So ideally, I'd be able to take a cell from your body, put it in a nutrient medium where it had everything it needs to survive, and it should be able to just carry on. Okay? That sort of makes sense? That cell should be able to carry out all the functions it needs on its own. Okay, number 3, new cells are not created. There is no factory in your body that manufactures cells. Okay, all cells come from the division of existing cells. And this is true all the way back to the moment of your conception. Okay? That moment when egg and sperm met, okay, you were one cell. Okay? It's called a zygote. Okay? That single cell divided over and over and over again to eventually form you. Okay? So there was no factory that was making cells. There was one cell that just divided over and over and over again until you arrived. Okay? And your cells continue to do that, okay, in order to replenish themselves. All right, everybody got the 3 points? Okay. All right, now, development of the cell theory. So the important people in the cell theory. Here's the thing, this is the part of the story I love to tell because I'm actually a physics guy, okay, not a biology guy. The person who first discovered cells was a physicist, Robert Hooke. Okay? He was doing an experiment on lens systems and the refraction of light. Okay? He was doing a physics experiment. He put 2 lenses in a row, put them the right distance apart, found that light was bent, and the effect of that bent light was to magnify things. Okay? So he's like, oh, cool, this makes stuff bigger. I'm going to look at stuff under this thing that I just built. Okay? And so he put a piece of cork that he had sliced, okay, underneath the microscope. Now, where does cork come from? Well, that cork probably came from a wine bottle, but cork comes from trees, okay? It's dead tree. So what are trees made out of? Cells, okay? So what he saw, this is what he drew, okay? What he saw under the microscope was all these empty spaces, okay? Now, the reason they were empty was A, the microscope wasn't very powerful, and B, this was dead, okay? So these are the remnants of the once living cells that made up this cork tree. So they appeared hollow, right? Like rooms in a prison. They don't have very much in them. They're empty little rooms. So he called them cells, okay? So this guy, Robert Hooke, who was a physicist, built the most important tool for biology. This is why all us physicists like to tell all the other sciences that they are inferior to physics. Okay? Here's why. Physics discovered the atom, without which there would be no chemistry. And of course, biology is just applied chemistry. And we built the most important device for all of biology. Physics says you're welcome. All right, so Robert Hooke, he discovers cells. Okay, probably the most important part, okay, of the history of the cell, okay, is the discovery of it. Okay, the knowing that it exists. Okay, and that was done through the building of the first microscope. Okay, now this microscope wasn't very good. You can buy a hand magnifier nowadays that goes 30 times. Okay, but this is in the early days of making lenses. Okay, that is shaping glass so that it bends light in a certain way. Okay, in order to magnify it and change its path. Okay, all right, so that's Hooke. Okay. After Hooke, people started doing all this stuff with lenses. The technology to build and make lenses got better, and so we were able to make microscopes that magnified at greater powers. Okay? Luckily for us, this particular design did not catch on. okay? Because it looks like a ping pong paddle, okay? So what you would do is you would put the specimen on the top of this little thing here, and then there was a lens here, and you would allow light to go through the specimen and then through the lens, and the lens would diverge the light, and if you stood over here, okay, or held it at arm's length, you could look through the lens and it would look bigger. If you had a really bright light source, you could put it on a screen behind you and make it a little bit bigger, okay? But it required a lot of finicky, fiddling around, okay, in order to make it work, okay? But if you could, if you had the lens right at arm's length, you could magnify something considerably, up to 300 times. Okay. All right, so Anton van Leeuwenhoek, okay, was the second important person, because Hooke built the microscope, looked at stuff and went, sweet, that worked, because he was a physicist. He didn't care about what the parts of the cell were. His experiment was done, okay? Leeuwenhoek was the first person to view living cells, okay, and to realize that cells may be the basic unit of life because they're in all living organisms, okay? So he looked at stuff in pond water, okay? So he put pond water in his microscope and could see that there were little tiny microscopic things swimming around in it, okay? He looked at blood cells, pricked his finger and saw that he had, there were red blood cells and white blood cells and all kinds of different cells in there, okay? Looked at sperm cells from cattle. I don't know how he got those. Okay, he would look at like skin cells. He looked at all kinds of things, but he looked at living cells. He noticed, different from what Hooke noticed, they're not empty. Okay, these cells are not empty. They're not empty little rooms. They're actually full of all kinds of stuff that's going on. Now, only being able to magnify 300 times, he couldn't see a lot of what was going on, but he realized, yeah, cells are living things, and there's a lot going on. Okay, so that was his main contribution, is noticing that all living things essentially contained, or many living things at least contained cells. Okay, by 1839, cells were effectively acknowledged as the basic units of life. Okay, they had been discovered in basically all living things. That's where these two Swedish gentlemen, Matthias Schleiden and Theodor Schwann, okay, came along. They developed the original cell theory. Okay, that is that their hypothesis was, if cells are the basic unit of life and tissues from various types of organisms are viewed under the microscope, then cells will be found in all of them. That was their working hypothesis. Okay? They discovered it to be confirmed. Okay? They looked at tissue from all kinds of organisms, from humans to bacteria, mosses, okay? Like just all kinds of stuff, all kinds of plants, all kinds of animals, and they found cells in all of them. And they also discovered that cells had a lot of similarities, regardless of whether they came from plants or animals. Okay? There were obviously differences, but there were a lot of similarities as well, which led them to the second point, that cells carry out the basic functions of the organism. Okay? And they were lucky enough to observe on several occasions that cells could split in half and create exact copies of themselves. And that was the only way that cells would be formed. Okay? They never found a place or a part of an organism that was producing cells. Okay? But they did find that cells could split in half and reproduce that way. Okay? And that's where they came up with the third part of the theory. So it's Schleiden and Schwann that came up with the cell theory. So they are two important names. Okay? Schwann and Schleiden came up with the cell theory. Okay, so they're like Dalton. Okay? They came up with this cell theory. Okay, so our ability to examine cells has gotten better. Okay, our technology has improved vastly. We now have scanning electron microscopes, transmission electron microscopes. We don't rely on light microscopes to do a lot of the kind of cellular dirty work, okay, and that is to see individual parts of the cell and what they do. Okay, we can now do that with things that can magnify thousands of times. Okay, we can nearly see at a molecular level what is going on within a cell, and it is a very, very busy place. But in doing that, we've also noticed that the cellular machinery for most cells is common. Okay, So if I'm looking at a plant cell and an animal cell, here and here, okay, there are obvious differences. Okay? A plant cell has a cell wall, and an animal cell doesn't. Okay? A plant cell has these green chloroplasts, the animal cell doesn't. But beyond that, are there a lot of things the same? Okay? They both have a nucleus, right? They both have a Golgi apparatus. They both have smooth ER, rough ER. Don't worry, we're going to go over all those parts and what they do later. Okay, they both have mitochondria. Okay, they have cytoplasm. They have ribosomes. They have just tons of things in common, and that's just the structures that they have in common. Okay, now that we can see what all those structures do, we see that plants and animals also have basically the same processes that are going on inside the cell. How they make proteins, okay? How they synthesize other materials, okay? How they request things, how they transport stuff. All of that stuff is similar. It's shared between plants and animals, right? What that likely means is that plants and animals are actually related. Okay? If we go back far enough, the history of life on Earth, we would find some ancestral organism that is the ancestor of both plants and animals. Okay, and if we go back far enough in the fossil record, we can find that. Okay, the first organisms on Earth, okay, were essentially photosynthetic, and then through the course of evolution, some of them developed the ability to consume food as opposed to produce it themselves. Okay, and that had certain advantages because consuming food means you get more of certain types of molecules and food items than you do if you're producing your own food all the time. And that led to changes, obviously, in the organisms over millions of years. Okay, but what we see is that plants and animals have a lot of similarities. Okay, the structure of their cells is more alike than it is unalike. Okay, and it is more likely that they share a common ancestor than they evolved all those things coincidentally. Okay, it's like the chances of you running across your doppelganger. Okay, you guys know what a doppelganger is, right? Okay, that person in the world who looks exactly like you. Okay, no one looks exactly like you. Okay? And even if they look a lot like you, that's still really coincidental. Okay, and it's a 1 in a billion chance. Okay, well, it's more like a 1 in a trillion chance that these two things evolved all of these structures separately. Okay, that's not likely. It's more likely that they got them from a shared ancestor. It's why you look like your mom or your dad. Okay, that's not a coincidence. It's because you share genetic material with them. You're related to them. Okay, well, it's the same thing. All right, everybody okay with that idea? All right, now, microscopes. So we'll be using the microscopes tomorrow. I'll bring one in tomorrow for class, okay, and just show you some of the techniques to do with it, okay? But a couple of things here with the microscope, and that is that you should always carry them with 2 hands, okay? Because I see people walking around, they're just carrying them by the arm, okay, with one hand. It's like they're carrying a bowling ball, okay? And we don't want to drop them. They're very expensive, okay? So we want to make sure we're carrying them the proper way, okay? We always want to return them with the lowest power lens in viewing position, just out of courtesy, because that's the one the next person's going to want first, okay? And then always start with the lowest power and move up. Don't try and find something on the high power, okay, right off the bat, because it's going to be nearly impossible, okay? And here's why. When I look through the microscope, okay, I'm not going to get away. Okay, so when I look through the microscope, when I look on scanning power, the lowest power lens, I don't magnify very much. It's not a very high magnification, but I can see a large area because I'm not magnifying very much. My field of view is very big. Okay? That makes it easy to find something, but not to see much detail. But that's all I'm trying to do initially, is find something to look at. So I want the large field of view and the low magnification. Right? As I move up in magnification from scanning to low power, I now see this much area, but I see it more greatly magnified. When I look through the microscope, this circle looks like the red circle to me, but I'm actually not seeing any of this area that's not overlapped anymore. I'm seeing the area within the blue circle magnified larger. Everyone Follow me there? So if I started on this magnification, and what I was looking for was over here, would I see it? No. My likelihood of finding it is a lot less if I start on anything other than the scanning power lens, which is what I'm supposed to use to scan the slide and find the stuff I'm looking for. Okay? When I move up to my high power lens, now I'm only seeing that much area. I'm seeing it much more greatly magnified. Okay? It's going to look a lot bigger. I'm going to see a lot more detail. But I have to make sure what I'm looking for is in that area, or I'm not going to see it. Okay? So we always want to start with the scanning power, okay, lens when we start out. Okay? This would be like if you were at the Saddle Dome and your friend was sitting on the other side of the Saddle Dome, and they sent you a text and go, hey, I'm over here. Okay? Now, if you're trying to find your friend, now let's say they're wearing like a bright yellow shirt. Okay? Do you want to take out a set of binoculars and start scanning the entire side one row at a time, or do you want to try and look with just your eyes to find a yellow shirt first? Right? Common sense says, I get a wider field of view without magnifying. Once I find a yellow shirt, then I'll pull out the binoculars and see if that's them. Oh no, that's not them. Find another yellow shirt. Oh, that's them. Okay? That's what you would do. And the same thing with the microscope. Start on the scanning power, the lowest magnification, find what you're looking for, and then move up. Now, in our microscopes, there's also a pointer. Okay? It's a black. It'll look black. It's actually brass, but when you look through the microscope, it looks black. Okay? And it just points to the exact center of the field of view. So if you find something on scanning power over here, you want to move it so it's here. Okay? And you can actually adjust the stage so that stuff moves, and you get it onto the end of the pointer before you move up to the next magnification. Because if I leave it out here and move up, I won't see it anymore. Okay? So that's why we have the pointer in there, and that's how we use it. Okay? All right. Questions on that? Okay, so tomorrow I'm going to go over detailed how you use the microscope. We're going to look at how to do lab drawings and do our pre-lab for the microscope lab tomorrow. Okay, so that'll be our day tomorrow. And then Thursday, we'll be doing the lab. Okay, we're going into the lab and using the microscope. No, question? No, tomorrow's Wednesday. Possibly.